This is U.S. History 1, PowerPoint Lecture 1.5 on the period of the Articles of Confederation, and it will bring us all the way up to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Now, in the last discussion, we talked about the American Revolution, and we finished it up with Yorktown. The treaty between England and the United States that will recognize U.S. independence is the Peace of Paris, which is a series of negotiations from 1781 to 1783. Now, what we're going to see, beginning immediately with the negotiated peace, is divisions within the newly formed United States. The trend that we're going to look at, and it will carry us all the way actually to the war between the states, and it's something that actually we've seen before. We actually kind of discussed it and looked at it in previous lectures, is because of the diversity of the English colonies, okay, which are now the United States. There is limited coincidence of interest among them. Okay, that's now going to start playing out. What brought them together, and as I've noted before, barely brought them together, was a coincidence of interest against England. Okay, well, now England is gone, and so whatever little limited coincidence of interest they had is now going to subdivide. And one of the arguments actually that Alexander Hamilton makes in the Federalist Papers is that the United States doesn't really represent a unified sovereign interest, but is instead really three sovereign interests divided between the New England states, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. And so what we're going to start to see, and we're going to continue to see as we go through all the way up till the war between the states, is regional divisions and ideological divisions. Okay? And this will come out immediately in the Peace of Paris. If we look at the first point here, in the peace treaty, the United States will trade off access to the Gulf of Mexico, which is to say the port of New Orleans, to the British in exchange for access to the territorial waters off of eastern Canada, which is still under British control. This sets up immediately a regional division. The western areas of the now United States, the Piedmont region and Alleghenies, need the Mississippi River to be able to transport out to the Gulf of Mexico and then over to markets in Europe. Okay, by trading that off, they lose that. The only winners in this provision of the treaty is the Northeast, which is to say the New England states, because they now have access to fishing rights off the coast of Canada. The second provision is repayment of all debt between the United States and Great Britain. Now we're going to see this again, and it's going to cause a regional division, because the debt, this is pre-war debt, okay? At the time of the Revolution, the United States, or the colonies, are in debt to Great Britain, but not all of the colonies are in debt to Great Britain. The southern colonies, for example, are not. The middle colonies have a modest debt, okay? The New England colonies are deeply in debt to Great Britain, okay? So the agreement is that that debt will be repaid. The British agree to abandon the forts in the West, what is now modern-day Michigan and Ohio and Indiana, okay, which were the forts they held between the Mississippi River and the American colonies, and the limitation that was placed on them by the Proclamation Act, okay? Now, the first of the big problems that the United States is going to face during the war, in an effort to finance the war, the United States, the colonies individually, printed money. As a result of this, you have a tremendous oversupply of money in the system, and you'll have runaway inflation. It will be the worst inflation in U.S. history, greater than 400%. 7 of the states are printing continental script, okay, which is effectively at this point valueless. We remember as we go through this and as we frame the Articles of Confederation, which are originally adopted in 1777 but not ratified till 81, that the basis, the very philosophical basis of the American Revolution is republicanism. Okay, which is a term that is often misrepresented. Republicanism simply means limited national government. Okay, so we offer as a refrain the idea of republicanism and the idea of the social contract, that there is an agreement between the governed and the governing, and that agreement entails a limitation of sovereign authority. Okay, in May of 76, all of the states by this point have their own charters. These charters will be converted into formal constitutions, okay, which is to say formal versions of contracts. And when it gets to the sovereignty question, and we've talked about sovereignty briefly before, and we'll talk about it now from this point forward until we get to the war between the states. Sovereignty, simply stated, and this is one of these things in political science for which there's no general consensual agreement. It's one of these great debatable issues. But in general, sovereignty means recognition of no higher earthly authority. So it's a question of authority. Okay? You have two levels immediately in these newly formed United States. Okay, you have the state levels, which are the former colonies, and you have this now amorphous forming national level. Okay, this unified level. And the decision is made, and it will be framed in the Articles of Confederation, that the state governments are the supreme authority, that the national government has limited authority and limited control over the states. This is the original intention. This is the basis of the revolution. This was the objection to England, okay, was that the central government in England was usurping the sovereignty of the more or less autonomous colonies in North America. We are going to see this as a repeated trend from now until the war between the states. And ultimately, this is the question that's decided in the war between the states. The Confederate States of America, and we'll deal with this in great detail when we get there, but the Confederate States of America contend that state governments are the supreme sovereign authority, whereas Lincoln and the Union argue no, national authority is. And we'll deal with that as we go along. As I've said, the states at this point, at the time of the Revolution, all have their own charters. These will be formalized into constitutions, and there are certain common features among these constitutions. One of them is limited executive authority. This will ultimately be translated into the Articles of Confederation by there being no executive. Okay? There will be annual elections. This is another common denominator among them. There will be term limits. This is one of these debatable issues that continues to be debated in the United States, as whether or not term limits should be imposed. Because, I mean, you have some senators who've been there for 7 and 8 terms of office, and a term of office is 6 years for these guys. They've been in office for 50 years. They're career politicians. And we'll deal with this at greater length. There was an inherent suspicion, okay, of career politicians. And just kind of as an aside, if you want to read something on it, read Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. Alexis de Tocqueville writes in the middle of the 19th century. And this is just as the professional class of politicians in the United States is coming online. And he warns against the development of a professional class of politicians, people who that's their career. Okay? The idea of Republican government is that you have citizens that are governing. And the reason you have that is because the citizens are then subject to the laws that they pass. Okay? We'll deal with that at greater length. There is also implied in all of the state constitutions, either explicitly or implicitly, an impeachment process for how you get people out of office. And then the most unique thing, and one that's not going to be phrased in the Articles of Confederation because there's no reason for it, because you have a limited national government, it will ultimately be phrased in the U.S. Constitution, is a Bill of Rights. Each of the states guarantees in writing individual liberties. Again, this is consistent with the Republican ideal, what we called real Whig or country ideology, this idea of a limited government, republicanism itself. Ultimately, the guarantee, what it ultimately gets down to, just without getting too much into the philosophical basis of it, okay, Locke makes an argument, and a lot of this is going to be based on John Locke's Second Treatise of Civil Government, okay, that there are certain, and the other contractarians will go along with it, there are certain inalienable rights. These are rights that with which a human is born. Okay, these are given by God. This ultimately, in modern terms, will come to be the basis of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights adopted by the United Nations. Okay, that these are inalienable rights. You cannot give them up. They cannot be sacrificed. All right, these will be incorporated in this series of bills of rights. Okay, as to the Articles themselves, they are adopted in November of 77, but not ratified until 81. This is in the middle of the Revolution. They call for no national judiciary. Any judiciary authority will be reserved to the state governments. There will be no national executive. There will be a chairperson, a rotating chair of the Confederate Congress. Each state will take in turn for 1 year to chair the Confederate Congress, okay, to serve as the chairperson. The way the Congress is going to be set up is one state, one vote. No greater authority is going to be given based on a greater level of population. And we're going to see that there's going to be a debate on this when they come to abandoning the Articles and adopting the U.S. Constitution. This will become the great compromise, is a bicameral legislature. In the Articles, it's a unicameral legislature. One state gets one vote. This is very similar in modern terms to, for example, the way the European Union is set up. Okay, the Council of the European Union, of which there are 27 members, each state gets one vote. It doesn't matter what their wealth is. It doesn't matter what their population is. Each state is equal. The Articles also will build in term limits for the representatives. This models the state governments that we just talked about. And is an inherent prevention of the development of a career class of politicians. Okay, and we'll see this, and I'll go over this at great length later. This is going to be a problem because already in the 1780s, okay, really even before the revolution ends, already there is developing this career-oriented group of politicians. Okay, we're going to see this with the development of the nationalist movement. Now, and finally, what the Articles have is, and there's some reference, some some heed paid to the logistical difficulties of popular elections. Remember, we're back in the 18th century here. You don't have electronic voting. Okay, so it's difficult logistically to have voting over a long distance. And so it's decided that the representatives for the state governments will be elected by the state assemblies. The state assemblies will be popularly elected. And so it's indirect. And in fact, this is the way the U.S. Senate is until the 20th century. Okay. There are certain powers that we now take for granted in the national government that are excluded. Now, when it comes to the capacity to tax, it's a little inaccurate to say that they had no capacity whatsoever to tax. They had a limited capacity. For example, they had a capacity to tax to finance war, but it required a 2/3 majority vote. This is going to be also true in terms of treaties. Like, for example, a tariff, a tax on imports. Under the Articles, they're permitted to do this, but it requires a 2/3 vote to do it. Okay? Any amendments to this, any amendments to their ability to tax, in fact, any amendments to the Articles themselves, okay, require a unanimous vote to amend. Okay. And there you see it's officially effective as of March 1781. And this last point we're going to bring up again and again, because under the Articles of Confederation, to amend the Articles, okay, it's going to require a unanimous vote of the states. And there's great philosophical basis for this. Okay, the idea of not degenerating into minority or of not degenerating into tyranny of the majority. Okay, but at any rate, there are certain inconveniences and certain problems occasioned at the end of the war. Okay, that come up at the end of the war. What's going to happen through the 1780s is that the Articles of Confederation are going to demonstrate themselves to be uniquely incapable of dealing with these crises, which means that the only thing left to deal with the crises are the states on an individual level, which requires the cooperation of the states, and that's not going to happen. Okay, the first of the crises we already discussed briefly: post-war inflation. To finance the war, the United States simply printed money, seven of the states did, and issued bonds, borrowed money. They borrowed money principally internally. The largest, of course, it's become fairly well known at Robert Morris. The largest financier of the Revolutionary War was Robert Morris. Okay, they also borrowed internationally, most notably from Holland. After Holland started to lose after the Dutch started to lose their empire that we talked about in previous lectures, they became a financial capital. Okay, at the end of the 18th and early 19th century, they're the financial capital of Europe. This will change. It will ultimately become England, but at any rate. So that's the first of the problems. The second of the problems, okay, is a result of the mercantile system. We talked at some length about the mercantile system of trade. And what the mercantile system of trade did, operatively for what we're talking about now, the mercantile system of trade gave Great Britain a protected market for their manufactured goods in North America, in the colonies. That is now gone. The British will have to adjust to it. It also gave the Americans a protected market in England for their basic products, their raw materials, okay, agriculture and extraction. That is now gone. The problem with that being gone is that all of the other European powers have developed this mercantile system. They all give preferential treatment to the products from their colonies. Okay? With me so far? Simple enough? Which means that they protect their markets in Europe and their markets in their colonies against foreign trade from, say, for example, the United States. And so the United States is going to lose a great deal of revenue in exports. Now, this is a point that we want to belabor for a minute. Okay, we want to really stress this point because it's extremely significant. It's the beginning of the diminution of wealth, particularly in the southern colonies. Okay, now if we look at this regionally, let's look first at New England. New England really doesn't suffer from this at all. They're not the ones that are exporting to the Europeans. They're not the ones that are exporting to England. So when the protected market in England is lost, they don't really suffer. In fact, they're going to benefit because England no longer has a protected market for its manufactured goods in the United States. That void is going to have to be filled. It will ultimately be filled by the development of a manufacturing sector in New England. So that's one thing. Who's going to be hurt the most are the southern colonies. The southern colonies have benefited greatly from having this protected market in England and throughout the British Empire. That's now gone. The problem is that they can't replace that protected market with markets in France and Holland and Spain and those empires, because they all have protected markets for their own colonies. So the U.S. is kind of left out in the cold. This doesn't really hurt the New England states. It desperately hurts the southern colonies. This will be the beginning of the division between the northern colonies and the southern colonies. Okay? Now, in the last point that we have on this PowerPoint, you want to take a look at this and couple it with the general inflationary trend. Okay? And just to rest on this for a second. Okay? Inflation is the result of too much money in the system. This is why at the end of the revolution, the United States has 400% inflation, because they have too much money in the system. Okay, they have too much money in the system from financing the war. Okay? This is going to be repeated. This happens all the time. It'll happen after the Civil War. If we were to go all the way into U.S. history too, it happens after World War I, after World War II. It's something you have to deal with. Okay, the Articles of Confederation are incapable of dealing with this. There is no provision in the Articles of Confederation for currency control or for monetary control for the national government. Okay, so it's up to the states to try to control this. And so you have two things happening simultaneously. You have too much money in the system, which is causing inflationary pressure. That's causing prices to rise. At the same time, you have no European goods coming in, okay, because they have preferential markets which make their goods cheaper, so they don't come in to compete. And so New England begins to develop this manufacturing sector. The problem is their marginal cost of production is too high, and so that's going to also increase prices. And so you have massive price increases, okay? At the same time that you have this massive price increase, because the colonies have lost their protected markets in England, demand for colonial products, now the United States, demand for American products drops. Okay? So prices are rising as a result of the post-war inflation, and demand for American goods drops. As demand for American goods drops, okay, the demand to produce them drops, the demand for the laborers to produce them drops, and as a result of the drop in the demand for labor, wages drop. So you have two things happening simultaneously. You have prices increasing and wages dropping. Okay? This is a dangerous situation. It means people lose their purchasing power, and this will trigger a recession. And so immediately, this new republic that has been born from the Peace of Paris suffers from a massive recession. Immediately. Okay? And because the articles aren't designed to deal with such an economic crisis, in fact, they're incapable of dealing with it, nothing will be done. All right. We briefly discussed this idea of financing the war before, and we'll discuss it again now. Okay? The main ways in which the United States or the colonies finance the war against Britain is to print money, which massively increases the supply of it, and to issue bonds. Okay. And so principally Robert Morris and his ilk, people like Bobby Moe, okay, are lending the Continental Congress money to finance the war. Now, the intention is that after the war is over, this money will be paid back. The problem is that the paper currency after the war is effectively valueless. There is an oversupply of money, meaning that money has lost its value. And so all these guys holding these notes, like Robert Morris, object to the idea that they're going to be repaid face value for their bond. The debt's going to be repaid in paper currency because the paper currency is not worth anything. And so they want to be paid back in specie, in gold and silver. Okay? The other one you see there that I've written down is Alexander Hamilton. There are a number of financiers. Robert Morris is the largest. Hamilton is probably the second largest. Okay, but we want to understand what the problem is. Okay, ultimately, this is going to be one of the main reasons that Robert Morris himself goes bankrupt. Okay, because he's ultimately going to lose this argument. There's simply not enough specie in the system, not enough gold and silver in the system to be able to repay the amount of money that he lent. Okay, so this is ultimately going to be one of the contributory causes that forces him into bankruptcy. And it always strikes me as one of the really interesting things. Robert Morris University, our alma mater, was designed as a school of business in 1921. It always strikes me as unusual that you would name a school of business after a financier who went bankrupt. That just always strikes me as kind of singularly amusing, but at any rate. As a result of the Articles of Confederation being incapable of offering any solution to this economic crisis, this is beginning in the early 1780s, there is going to be a rising trend in favor of strengthening the national government. Okay? A few things will be proposed as this nationalist trend starts to rise up. The first will be some sort of unification of monetary policy. The development of a Bank of North America. This is first proposed by Alexander Hamilton with the intention of Robert Morris both funding it and being in charge of it. This will be defeated by the Confederate Congress, okay, because it gives the national government too much control over the supply of money. They then suggest, in order to help finance this debt, okay, and pay it off, that there be a 5% tariff imposed on imports. The southern colonies don't want this. All this does for the southern colonies is increase the price of manufactured goods. And so what the southern colonies are looking at is, if you impose this tariff, you already have an increased price for goods in general because of the inflation. If you impose the tariff, it increases the price of manufactured goods all the more. At the same time, demand for their products as a result of losing the protected market in England has dropped, meaning the price for their products has dropped. Okay? And so they're suffering from terms of trade. So they don't want the tariffs. So they get rid of them. Now the problem is this. Okay? And again, this is a problem within the Articles of Confederation. The New England states individually are fully capable under the Articles of Confederation and under their state constitutions to impose tariffs on imports. Okay? And so the New England states will individually, as states, impose tariffs on imports. Okay? The problem is that there are not permitted excise taxes between states under the Articles. Okay? In other words, one state is not permitted to tax the products of another state. This is one of the principal means by which you create a unified internal market, is you don't allow the regions within your national union to charge taxes on each other's goods. Okay? And so, for example, this exists in modern times. Okay? Pennsylvania can't pass an import tax on goods that come to Pennsylvania from Maryland. You can pass a sales tax, but that's on all goods that are sold in the state of Pennsylvania. Okay? But you can't pass an excise tax or a tariff tax. Okay? So too, that exists here. So the southern colonies, they don't adopt any tariffs at all. The northern colonies do. Those tariffs from the northern colonies become completely moot. They're meaningless, because instead exporters ship their goods to the southern colonies where there's no tariffs, and then the southern colonies can just ship them up north and not face the tariff, and so the tariff gets circumvented. Now, they begin to think in terms, and a number of states adopt it. You see, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New York. Okay? They'll assume, the state governments will assume a certain portion of the debt, 1/3, and refinance the debt. This is when they begin to start to think about this, and Hamilton's the one that comes up with the idea that what you want to do is, currently, the bonds that were issued, okay, now the bond is an IOU. Someone loans the government money. In exchange, they get a bond, which is an IOU for that money. Those bonds are effectively valueless because they're going to be paid back in what is effectively valueless currency. And so what we're going to do is reissue the bonds. Okay? Now, the only way that would work is if you can limit the supply of money. And so the ultimate problem here that I've got at before is, as a result of this, the creditors who own the debt, not just Robert Morris and his collection of profiteers, but also foreign countries like Holland that lent the United States money during the war. There's no way you can pay them back the actual value, the money that they lent you. Whatever you pay them back, if you pay them back in paper currency, is going to be worth less than what they lent you. And so they're going to lose big time. Which, from the debtor's point of view, that's not a big deal. What the hell do I care? Okay? But it matters from a creditor point of view. And more importantly, if that condition exists, nobody's going to lend you any more money. If your money is continually losing value, why would anybody lend you money? They know that if they lend you money, when you eventually get around to paying it back, the money you pay it back with is going to be worth less than the money they lent you, and they're going to end up losing their shirt. Okay? And so they're not going to lend you money. And so that's the serious problem that we're facing here. To reiterate the point made earlier, okay, we're now going to look at the regional economic divisions. And as I've said before, we're going to see a lack of coincidental interest among the regions. Let's look first at the Northeast, which is to say the New England states. Under the mercantile system, under the navigation acts, as we've seen before, they had no cash crop, they had no agriculture and extraction to exploit to make any kind of money. Okay? Their only hope was a manufacturing sector, the development of a manufacturing sector, which they were prohibited from doing under the mercantile system. Well, that's gone now. They can develop the manufacturing system. Okay? The problem is, and I will attempt as best I can to spare you the technical economics. This is stuff that you would learn in microeconomics. When you first begin to produce a product, you face your highest marginal cost. And so, as manufacturers attempt to develop in New England, they face a high marginal cost, especially in comparison to their European counterparts, all of whom have been producing manufactured goods for a considerable time. Okay? In other words, the English manufacturing sector has developed an economy of scale. They're producing cheaply. The Americans are not. As a result, this places American manufacturing at a competitive disadvantage. To compensate for this, there are two principal means. One, you subsidize the development of your manufacturing sector, okay, which the New England states will do. And they are within their rights to so do under the Articles of Confederation. Under their state government constitutions, they're allowed to do this. Fine. The other way is to pass taxes on imported goods. British goods are produced more cheaply because they have an economy of scale. And so they would be cheaper in the American market. To compensate for this, you tax the hell out of them. You tax them at such a level that they'll come even with American products, removing their competitive advantage. Fine and dandy. However, the southern colonies don't favor this approach. Their advantage is in free trade. If they go passing a bunch of tariffs against England and the other Europeans, okay, two things are going to happen. One, the price of their manufactured products is going to go up. In other words, the price of their imports, the price of the manufactured goods that they're purchasing from Europe will go up, contributing to the already inflationary trend that's going on. Secondly, in retaliation, the Europeans will pass tariffs against American products. And the South benefits. Their entire economy is based on exporting their goods. Okay, so this becomes a serious problem for them. So they're opposed to any kind of tariffs. As a result of this, as I mentioned earlier, this is going to neutralize the effect of the tariffs that the New England states trade, because the exporters from Europe will simply ship their goods to the South, and then it'll be shipped north. So already you have these divisions. It will ultimately lead to secessionist movements. Both the Northeast and the South will threaten secession from the Union. This will happen after the Constitution, but that's just kind of to foreshadow it. All right. All of this conflict, this dissonance of interest between debtors and creditors, is going to culminate in Shays' Rebellion in New England. Okay? And I've mentioned this before. I'm just going to reiterate this point. Because of the lack of value of paper currency, because paper currency has effectively become valueless, Robert Morris, as representative of a number of other creditors, will demand to be paid back the money that they lent the Continental Congress. They're going to demand to be paid back in specie, in gold and silver. Well, there isn't enough gold and silver in the system to do that. Okay? That's a fantasy. You can't do that. This is why they're going to reissue bonds at a lower level. Okay? The debtors, for their part, they want to be able to pay back the financiers, the creditors, in paper money. Why wouldn't they? The paper money is effectively valueless. Okay? They don't have the kind of wealth in gold and silver necessary to repay the debt. And so these two are at loggerheads. It's going to lead to a rebellion. The debtors, okay, are going to storm the gates of the Massachusetts legislature and demand the issuance of more paper currency, which will exacerbate the problem. The ultimate problem that we're all facing here is there's too much money in the system, too much paper currency particularly. Okay, when Shays' Rebellion takes place, and it's named for the guy that leads the rebellion, they will storm the Massachusetts legislature and demand more money be issued, more paper currency be issued, and that they be allowed to repay their debts in paper currency. Okay? All of this reflects probably the greatest difficulty with the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation is singularly incapable of dealing with this crisis. It requires then the complicity and the cooperation of all of the states. If some of them cooperate and reduce their supply of money, that's not going to work. It has to be all of them that do it. Okay? As it works out, all of them will do this. It's in their best interests to do it. Okay? Because all of the creditors in each of the states, all of the people that have lent money in each of the states, is going to lose out here. Okay? There has to be some balance struck. And so they're going to begin to ratchet down the supply of money. Meaning that when you ratchet down the supply of money, the supply of paper currency, the value of it is going to go up, and you'll come closer to being able to repay the creditors at face value. Rhode Island, for its part, refuses to cooperate. The most significant things that are achieved under the Articles of Confederation come in the middle of the 1780s. And we want to pay very close attention to these. Okay? Because it's going to become a very controversial point later on as we get into the next panel, as we get into Epic 2, and even into Epic 3. This is going to become a very controversial issue. Okay? The first of them is the Land Ordinance of 1785. Okay? This is basically how you're going to now divide, how the U.S. government, and this is within the Articles of Confederation. This is the Confederate Congress. This is how the Confederate Congress is going to divide up the newly acquired U.S. territory taken after the Revolution, okay, taken as a result of the Revolution. You divide it all into 36 sections of 640 acres. That 36 sections of 640 acres is referred to as a township. So a township is 36 times 640 acres. Okay, that exists today. That it still operates that way. Okay, and this is also largely the reason that once you get west of Ohio, all of the states take a certain square shape. If you look out west, for example, all the states have a certain geometric squareness to them, or rectangular. They're not odd shaped. Like in the east, you look at Delaware, you look at Rhode Island, you look at Connecticut, you look at Vermont and New Hampshire. They have an odd shape to them. Out west, that's not the case. This is because out west, the way the territory is divided is based on the Land Ordinance of 1785. Okay? And so it tends to systematize and make uniform the division of the territory. The purchase price for land will be $1 per acre. This will be the primary source of government revenue. From this point, which is really 1781, all the way until the 20th century, the early 20th century, there will be two principal sources of government revenue: land sales and tariffs. After the Civil War, something we get into a little bit, after the Civil War, additionally to this will be land tax after the Homestead Act of 1863. We'll deal with that later on. Okay, so this sale of government land for $1 an acre is going to become, especially because for reasons that we've talked about already here, the tariffs are going to be completely moot. Whatever tariffs are passed by the New England states will be rendered completely ineffective by the southern colonies. And no national tariffing policy, no national trade policy is possible under the Articles. Okay? And so that won't be a source of revenue. The only real source of government revenue then is going to be the sale of land at $1 an acre. More significant to us, ultimately, as we go through the remainder of our course, is the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787, because this one establishes how, under what conditions, a territory, as defined by the Land Ordinance of 1785, a territory will become a state. And you see here, it's listed here, okay? 3 to 5 states will be created by the new territory. That's the original intention. Of course, as the United States spread westward, this will change. Originally, okay, while it's still a territory, okay, each territory will have a governor, a secretary, and 3 to 5 judges. Once the population of that territory reaches 60,000, the state is then allowed to devise its own constitution and then apply for statehood. This is the first time also that we're going to see slavery mentioned. Slavery will be prohibited north of the Ohio River, which is to say Pennsylvania, okay, and points north. And Ohio. Ohio will therefore not be allowed to have slavery in its constitution. They don't envision the problem that this is going to cause as they move westward, because the Ohio River ends in Illinois. Okay? So what do you do with the territory? It ends at the Mississippi River. The Ohio River ends at the Mississippi. So when you move west, okay, what are we going to do then? Because we don't have the Ohio River anymore as a demarcation line. Well, we'll deal with that in the Missouri Compromise. The Southeastern Ordinance, which is a subordinance of the Northwest Land Ordinance, is that slavery will be permitted south of the Ohio River. Now, we want to pay attention to these lines. This will become an extremely significant point later on. Okay, especially when we get to the Missouri Compromise, and I'll reserve the discussion of that until we actually get to the Missouri Compromise. Okay, so we want to stress this point. We want to keep this in mind. How the states, there's no provision for a state constitution to be ratified at the national level. The other states don't have to approve your constitution. All right. Okay.